You know, when we came, SABC management and labor unions were at real loggerheads, mainly around salaries. There was so much differential in salaries and so on. So the unions were a problem for us, particularly trying to deal with the turnaround and headcount reduction and so on. So Hlaudi was assigned to the board's communication person. He would deal with and stakeholder manager on behalf of the board, not just the GCO. And that is how he got to ultimately become an acting COO, because now a lot of assignments were being given him to deal with.
Yes. And then ordinarily, who's responsible for appointing people to these executive positions in an acting capacity?
Well, the CEO
Yes.
appointed him in his office, but we needing active service in terms of communication, in terms of dealing with issues like the Auditor General's findings, and many other aspects that were very thorny at the time. He was then appointed acting COO.
Yes. Could you just tell the chairperson what skill did he bring? I mean, if you're talking about the chief operations officer, you're talking about the Auditor General's findings. Those are largely matters that would deal with the financial aspects of the organization. So what is the skill that he was bringing on board to deal with those matters?
Well, the skill was people's skill. You know, Mr. Alvain, who appointed him in 1995, said that initially he had been a stringer for sports. But the way he wrote sports reports were very attractive to the listeners. And so he brought him into other aspects of SABC, like news, because he had this ability to create a story. So I would say, in short, the skills he had were people skills.
Well, for more on the state capture inquiry, we cross to our reporter, Manqoba Mchunu, who's standing by for us. Manqoba, so Mr. Hlaudi Motsoeneng was employed as COO because of his people skills. Just elaborate on that.
Well, certainly, Nompu, the appointment of Hlaudi Motsoeneng is under the spotlight here at the State Capture Commission. Of course, questions being raised as to how he was appointed to that top executive position, of course, after having been worked at the Free State as a radio producer for news. And of course, Mr. Ben Ngubane, or Dr. Ben Ngubane rather, saying that, Hlaudi had people skills. He says that Hlaudi was a troubleshooter and he was a hands-on person. And that's one of the reasons why he said Hlaudi was then appointed to the office of the GCEO as a stakeholders manager at the time. But interestingly, his role also extended to the SABC board, in which he was not a part of or a member of. And he says, of course, he had to relate some of the information from the board or some of the board decisions to the staff. And so he says that's the reason why Mr. Motsoeneng was seemingly the right candidate for the post of COO, because he was simply a people's person.
So did he perhaps speak further about Mr. Motsoeneng's qualifications? It's one thing to have people skills, but what about the qualifications?
Well, certainly, Nombu, that is an issue that was just under scrutiny now, just before we broke for lunch. And of course, questions being raised about the qualifications that Mr. Motsoeneng had at the time. Of course, we do know that he does not have a matric certificate, for example, and such a top executive position will require, of course, some sort of, a degree or even a honors degree or master's degree for that matter, So questions being raised about his appointment. Of course, there were allegations earlier on, you recall, in that parliamentary parliamentary process, inquiry into the SABC in 2017, questions being raised about, of course, allegations that Dr. Ben Ngubane himself, as the board chairperson at the time, had actually asked for those qualifications to be revised and basically for those qualifications to be removed so that it could suit Hlaudi Motsoeneng to be appointed in that position. And so he still insists at this point that, he has never instructed that those alterations be made to that advertising that post, of course. And he says that, he's also never given any instruction to that effect. This is despite, of course, some of the claims that were made by the former CEO, Hlaudi Manqoba, when she spoke to the public protector to say that, it was, in fact, the board chairperson who had said that, this need to be altered so that, it could suit Hlaudi Motsoeneng. But, of course, he still denies that. We know that he did deny this in 2017 before Parliament, and he still stands by his words to say that he has never instructed such.
Manqoba, interestingly, Dr. Ngubane does mention that the SABC's financial condition was just fine when he left as board chair in 2013.
Well, of course, he says that at the time when he came here, he does admit, though, that the SABC's finances were under stress, he says. And, of course, he says that at the time, the previous board chairperson and the board had applied for 1.6 billion bailout from government or guarantee from government. And, of course, he says when they took over, he says that they tried somehow to resuscitate the SABC's dire financial situation. And funny enough, Nompu, the issue of the New Age breakfast show also coming up today with questions being raised about it. Of course, you'll recall that we've heard evidence that it ultimately cost the SABC 20 million rand, whereas the public broadcaster had not benefited a cent from it. And in fact, the SABC CFO, Yolanda van Pellew, last week testifying that the operational costs alone were in the round of 4 million rand. So questions being raised about that venture as to whether he had any part in it. But of course, he maintains that it was simply SABC News division that dealt with this matter. He had no authority as a board chairperson to deal with this matter. But interestingly, he says that, he believes that this venture was basically a benefit to the SABC. It added value to the SABC in a sense that its revenue, advertisement revenue that is, went up at the time of these briefings. But he was also asked about his relationship with the controversial Gupta family. And of course, he says that he has met the Guptas on a number of occasions through this breakfast show. Let's take a listen to what his answer was on this.
There was this business partnership for morning breakfasts. I attended those breakfasts, not all of them, but quite a lot of them. And I would sit with the people in the New Age, editors, members of the Gupta family. And on a few occasions, I went to social events at their home. And that is really the exposure I had to that family.
Yes. Were you, just as the start of the New Age newspaper, were you involved at all? Did you assist with the negotiations of the New Age deal and the TNA breakfast?
No, this was an initiative through our news desk, our news editorial board, and officials in news. We only got involved where I had to go and probably make a speech to introduce the minister at a breakfast meeting and that sort of thing. But we were not involved as a board in the actual negotiations.
Well, of course, he also admitted to the fact, that he says that he's never at all ever benefited the Guptas in anyhow in their business ventures. And of course, he says that his relationship was strictly limited to these TNA breakfast briefings.
All right, Manqoba, thank you very much for that report. We're going to leave it there. My colleague Manqoba, who's at the State Capture Inquiry in Zinga, over to you.